Welcome to Driving Participation with Beth, a podcast for sharing great ideas that get people involved and active in organizations. Join us to learn what marketers and fundraisers around the country are doing to get people to show up, stick around, and give back.
Hello, and welcome to Driving Participation. I am Beth Brodowski, and I am thrilled today to have Vanessa Chase here with me. Vanessa is a fundraising consultant and the founder of the Storytelling Nonprofit. And I was lucky enough to happen to pick a chair and sit down next to Vanessa at the N10 conference in 2014, just about a month ago. And upon coming back, one of my staff members coincidentally said, "You should really get in touch with this woman." And since we just met, I thought this was a perfect opportunity to connect with Vanessa and hear a little bit more about what she is doing, because we've been talking a lot lately about why storytelling matters and how storytelling can be such a great resource to connect with donors at a really deep level and get them involved and engaged. So thank you so much for joining me, Vanessa.
Thank you so much for having me today, Beth. It's a pleasure to be here.
So one of the first things I like to ask people is, how did you get involved in doing what you do?
It's a good question. I sometimes still wonder that myself.
Exactly. Yeah, right. Don't we all?
Yeah. I've been in fundraising and communications now for about 5-ish years. And I started at the University of British Columbia. So I was working in higher education fundraising for a couple of years, and then worked at a small social service here in Vancouver, Canada, where I'm based. And while I was at that second organization, I really had the pleasure of starting to understand donor relations in a much deeper way than I had previously. I was managing an annual giving portfolio at that time, and I just found it kind of interesting that whenever I would have conversations with donors on the phone, or I'd go out to meet with people, I'd ask them about things that they knew about our work or if they were interested in learning more. And so often I found that people just didn't know that much about us or what we were really doing as an organization. And it was mystifying to me because they were continuing to give, yet we weren't really having this kind of open two-way communication with them. And I saw that as kind of an issue for us to tackle. And so we started really revamping a lot of our communications and fundraising materials to include stories and really speak to impact at an actual deeper level than just telling people that they were having an impact. And we saw such amazing results from that. And that really inspired me to kind of look at that issue more holistically in the sector. And so I started doing some consulting work around that, which has led me to where I am today.
That is terrific. I'm always fascinated by people's paths and how they became interested in things, especially because, I suppose unless you're going to school right now, many of us who, got our educations earlier, there was no nonprofit management degree. There wasn't sort of an obvious path to pick working with a nonprofit as a career. So it's fascinating to hear how people came to doing this kind of work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very true. My background education-wise is in fine arts and literature, so definitely not obvious choice.
So you just never know. So you always want to tell people, tell your children they should just major in whatever makes them happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So one of the first things I want to ask you is, why storytelling? So why is the concept, the structure, the sort of functionality of storytelling so good for getting people involved? Why does it work so well?
Mm-hmm. That's a really great question. It's one I think I've really thought about a lot in the last year or so in the work that I've been doing and working on my book. I think it kind of comes from just the fact that we naturally communicate with each other in stories, in our communication in our day-to-day lives and with friends and family and colleagues. You think about the communication you have with them on the phone or, around the water cooler at work. You're telling them stories, but you're not necessarily thinking about it. It's just how you structure communication with them. And it's how we engage with one another. It's much more interesting than just telling them kind of this chronological series of things that happened to us over the weekend, or just kind of arbitrary things that have been going on. We tell them a story about that kind of collective period of time. And so I think bringing that into the nonprofit world, it's an opportunity for us to engage people emotionally with what's going on at our organizations, rather than just telling them factual information about what's going on, the programs and services we're providing. We can provide them with context by telling them a story so that they fully understand the meaning of those facts and statistics that we might throw their way. And we can also get their emotional buy-in to what's happening, which is another really important aspect of storytelling and in relation to fostering donor loyalty and donor happiness.
I think that's a really, really good point, especially what you said about creating the meaning around the facts and figures, because so many people, they're so proud of the
Yeah.
impact that they've had and what they've done, that they want to demonstrate that impact by communicating the bigness of it,
Yeah.
the big numbers and stuff and things like that. And without context around that, big numbers just get lost on people. And I find that often shocking. I mean, do you feel the same thing, that sometimes communicating the big story of what someone's doing doesn't connect as well as the little stories?
I would fully agree with that. Yeah, I think that's been one of the interesting things to me about the work that I've done in the last year or two around storytelling is this idea of context. I now kind of refer to it as the donor knowledge gap.
Oh, yeah.
Being at a nonprofit, if you're working in-house or if you're a consultant working with an organization, you're lucky enough to be there day in and day out, seeing what's going on, seeing the action in the trenches. And you kind of start to take for granted what you know already about the cause. You have much more information and context than your donors will probably ever have about that, unless they're really passionate activists and have just like learned things on their own merit about what's happening with the cause. And so it's just really important to honor where your audience is at with what they know, because when you have an idea of what they know about the cause, you can start to speak to them in a more meaningful way, and build up that knowledge base that they may have so that you can talk to them in different manners or in a way that just makes sense for them contextually in their day-to-day life.
That
But
makes so much sense.
And going back to your question though about the small stories versus the little stories, I think what's powerful about the small stories is that you demonstrate to someone on a micro level of what your organization is able to do. One person's life that you're able to change, one animal that you've helped, one petition that you've gone through, whatever that might be. And when you can paint that picture of what's possible on a micro level, you can also show people what's possible on a macro level. So you can tell them, this is just one instance of what we've done in the last year, but we've helped 500 other people like John or whatever that might be, to then show them that that impact of that one person has scaled to many and that it's not just this small thing, but, they're really part of a much larger movement or cause.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, so I want to go back to what you were first talking about on, what the outside donor knows and sort of how the organization really, lives it every day. I have a friend that calls it inside baseball,
Yeah.
that like, you're the players and you get it. And so sometimes it's so hard to translate that. So, I mean, I know I see problems with that sometimes with, the development team, really sort of knows what they want to communicate, but they sometimes have trouble selling it to the executive
Mhm.
staff or the board to make them understand why these are the right stories. Or sometimes an entire organization just struggles with really knowing, what do our donors know? What do they understand? How do we segment and translate and oh, let me explain that for you more deeply. So,
Mhm.
do you have any suggestions on, how people can figure out, what's too deep, what's too broad, what are the right pieces that they should be extracting and how they should be doing it? And also, how they can get people in their organization to buy into this concept.
Mhm. I think it's a twofold approach, really. I mean, it starts with research on your audience and getting to know them better, and then developing one or more audience personas around who your
Hmm.
donors are,
We've been
and
talking about that
getting
a lot lately.
yes, yeah, it's something I love talking about because I think it's one of the simplest things you can do, but it's also one of the most powerful tools that you can have in your toolkit in terms of fundraising and communication knowledge. So, research wise. And I think this is where people get stuck sometimes when I talk about creating an audience profile or when other people tell them to do it. they have this hard time thinking that they can, summarize all 10,000 of their donors into one person. and
Yes.
and that's not really the point of the exercise. I always try to remind people of that, you're not trying to just like create one profile that fits all your donors. You may have multiple segments, and that's not even the important part. The important part is just that you're trying to kind of get a big picture view of the trends and emerging thoughts in the audience so that you can kind of speak to those directly. And so there's a number of ways you can do that. I mean, surveying through phone, through email, doing online surveys are all great ways to kind of capture some information about your audience, figure out where they're at with things. Doing research through Google Analytics, if that's what your website is using to process information, and I hope it is, it's a great tool.
Yeah.
And I would also just suggest, picking up the phone and talking to people. It's one of the greatest things I ever did as a fundraiser was making thank you phone calls to donors.
Right.
And the more I talked to people, the more I really understood where they were at with understanding our cause and the issue. I heard the words that they used to describe it, which were the words that resonated with them, not the words that I would use.
Right.
And, it gives you that very tangible image of who your audience really is when you talk to them. So whether you're on the communication side or in fundraising, it's really important to talk to at least a handful of those people. And if you have a few that you feel really comfortable with, if you talk to them a few times, or maybe a major donor that someone else is managing, getting their feedback on things too is a really powerful way to engage them. So if you're thinking about a couple of options for messaging or for marketing, whether it's with stories or something else, presenting those options to the donors and saying, what do you think of these? Like, what makes sense to you and what do you really like? And really letting them drive the decision-making process, I think can be a really powerful tool.
That is, I know it seems scary to people a lot to kind of put the brand or the story back into their hands, but really having a sense of what is going to really connect with people can really make a difference. It's not that you won't bring your expertise to it, but it's so easy to focus on what we believe or what we know. We've had situations with organizations that were absolutely sure they knew what their industry was called. And then in doing some research, we discovered that the people who were looking to come into an industry, it was a college, for example, that was in a specific training program, they called the profession something completely different than the school thought it was called, because they didn't, the people who were already in the industry knew what it was called, but people who were looking to get into an industry didn't know what it was called. And it's amazing how when you find those things out and you can then flip around and speak to people in the language of this stage of that they're in with an organization. I always call it, you need to have your connoisseur message and your consumer message. How you talk to those people who are already like deep in and know your jargon. Like if you don't use those insider words with the people that really know, then they're going to think you don't know what you're doing, but if you use all that sort of inside language, people who are not yet initiated, they're going to be lost.
Yeah, exactly. I guess to further the example you were talking about, I remember when I was at the University of British Columbia, we would often refer to ourselves internally as like the institution, as the school, but no alumni would ever call it the institution that they went to.
Right, it's so funny.
Yeah, they would casually refer to it as the campus or the school or the university, whatever that might be. But it's interesting, though, that just those little nuances in language can make such an impact. And they're so often overlooked because we just think that the language and the terms that we have in our own mind and with our colleagues are kind of like the normalized ones that everyone knows. And I think it's really important to recognize that sometimes our breadth of knowledge can also be a limitation.
Oh, absolutely. It really, really can. I always tell people when I talk about branding, go tell a third grader what you do. And if you can make them understand what you do, then you've got it. That you've got a good consumer level story. And I know that might sound insulting, but the reality is, if you can simplify what you do far enough back that a kid can understand it, then you can build back up from there. But it's amazing how we use such complicated words and sentences to describe things that, I'll be reading something sometimes and I realize that I'm 4 lines in and I haven't hit a period yet.
Yeah.
So the next thing I wanted to ask you was, not all of us are trained as journalists, but everyone's talking about getting stories and communicating with stories.
hmm
So when people are talking to their donors or on the phone or making those thank you calls, what kind of things should they be looking for in order to kind of extract a good story from the person that they're talking to?
hmm Well, I think when you're trying to extract audience stories from your donor audience, it's a little bit different than, client stories or stories from volunteers.
Exactly, yeah.
The stories that you'll mostly tell about a donor will be the stories about why they care about the cause and why they continue to donate. Those are usually the most kind of compelling stories for other donors to hear, and usually the ones that most often relate to the cause directly. And I find those are actually pretty easy to kind of try to drum up in conversation.
Hmm.
A question as simple as asking someone, why did you start donating to our organization, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, whatever that might be.
Right.
And just asking them is kind of a gateway question. I mean, I can't even count the number of times that I've asked that question and gotten really interesting responses from people who have started donating because of a personal story of theirs or, whatever that might be. And those are the times when I would frequently just write down what I was hearing from that donor, whether it was in their database record or in a separate file I was keeping, just a track of like story leads that I had for newsletters and things like that. And just jotting down the person's name and their donor ID so I could figure out who they were in the database again. And also just a few of the details about the story. And oftentimes I would find just writing those down and kind of keeping my own story bank per se.
Yeah.
I would frequently refer back to that whenever I needed pieces for a newsletter or for an annual report. And I had all of those leads already. So it wasn't difficult for me to pick up the phone again and call someone and say, hey, the last time we talked, you told me this great story and I would really love to feature it in a newsletter. Would you be okay with that?
Oh, that's
And
great.
then maybe being able to go back to them again and asking them a few more details the second time around, because I've heard the story once already,
Hmm.
just to verify facts or get some more information from them to include in it.
And have you had good luck when you've had to do that? Do you ever call and ask them for, a picture or other resources, things like that, that you can help illustrate the story?
Absolutely, yeah. I with donor stories, I find it's much easier to get a hold of a picture. With clients or people who are nonprofit serving, sometimes there'll be issues
Right.
with sensitive issues where people would prefer to remain anonymous.
Hmm.
Or if your organization works with kids, that's another one where it's kind of tricky to get some photos. Um, Donors, I find, have less qualms about wanting to have their face in public. Most of them probably want to be recognized in some capacity, and I found for most that I've talked to and worked with, it's this really kind of fun way that they're being appreciated by the organization for their giving, and they want to be a part of that in some larger way. And so they're usually much more willing to share a few more details about their story, about their life, or provide a picture if we ask.
Oh, that's
Mhm.
great. Then people have to go and write these stories.
Mhm.
What do you typically do? Do you typically write out verbatim what they say? Is there a story structure or any sort of writing tips and techniques that you've found that make a story seem really compelling, really do what you want it to do?
Mhm. That's a great question. So I think the temptation is always just to kind of write it out in chronological form,
Hmm.
because that's just how we get it and that's how we think we should retell it, which I wouldn't necessarily disagree with. Sometimes it's good to keep the original person's tone and voice and language intact, kind of for authenticity purposes. I find that's more true with clients than it is with donors, but I think what makes a great story is a couple things. The character who's involved, and the conflict, and also the resolution of whatever that conflict was. and
Right.
so I think when you kind of repurpose a narrative from someone into a full story for a communications piece, it's really important to start off in the first couple of sentences with the action and kind of the initial conflict, and introducing kind of this lovable, likable character, your donor in this instance, and kind of helping people empathize with what that problem may have been or what the conflict may have been and why they should care about that. I find that starting kind of right in the action is a really great way to draw people in very quickly to a story. Versus kind of saying, 5 years ago, so and so started donating to our organization. It's a little bit more interesting to say, 5 years ago, they were, let's say it's a humane society. They picked up a dog on the side of the road that was a stray and they brought it to the animal shelter, but they decided that they wanted to keep it instead and ended up becoming a donor some years later after having this dog. Something like that, where it's a little bit more action based than it is just kind of like this chronological story. I think the other thing too is that it's really important to kind of build up the conflict for people, whatever that might be. And so that they kind of buy into the drama and whatever's happening with the character. That always makes it a little bit more emotionally engaging. And of course, giving them some resolve to that at the end. It's important to always give the audience resolve once you've kind of drudged them through this story. So that they feel like they know what happened at the end and that they feel kind of emotionally satisfied after having read it.
I think that's a really, really good point, because I think a lot of us that write, everybody can type and put words on a page. It's sometimes hard to know, like, what does this storytelling thing really mean? And what's the difference between a story and then just sort of documenting an interview with somebody? How do you, those little tips that really help you pull a record of what happened into this world of touching the emotional heartstrings and really finding how to present that story in a way that really does communicate how these people feel about their involvement with the organization and with the cause that it supports.
Yeah, that's a great point, Beth. And I think I've seen a lot of people struggle with that too, that, they get testimonials from clients and they feel like that's kind of, the crest of what their organization
can do. Check that off my list. Done.
Yeah. They're like, this is it. We're done. But I think that the interesting thing to me about, when I look at kind of the landscape of storytelling, so traditionally we think about it as kind of big fairy tales, Disney movies, fiction novels. That's kind of where traditional storytelling lies. But when we pull it into this realm of organizational communication and storytelling, it becomes much more of a strategic endeavor than I think a lot of people give it credit for. So storytelling is just another tool in our box that we can use to engage people in a call to action or in a compelling message or marketing campaign. And I think that one of the key things that I always recommend before you ever sit down to write the story or even go out to find it is to think about, what is the purpose of telling this story? What's your strategy behind it? What's the call to action that's involved? And I think that when you kind of have a notion of what those things are, you can really maximize the story that you find, because then you know exactly the call to action that you're driving people to as you write the story and kind of build up the conflict. You know the audience, so you also know the type of character that you need to look for to hopefully resonate best with the audience that you're speaking to. And I think you can also start to put it into the bigger picture of your marketing or fundraising plan. So, as a part of a campaign or a specific appeal, something like that. So it's not just like this random one-off story, but it's more cohesive and a part of something bigger that your organization is doing strategically.
That's actually perfect, because that leads into my next question. But I'm really glad that you brought those points up first before I moved into, where do you put all of this stuff? Because it's so easy. I know when we work with people a lot, I'm writing a newsletter and I need a story to fill page 2. So it's so easy to think of that story that I'm collecting and why I'm collecting it as I need content for this thing. Fill in the blank. And to make sure that before you start thinking about the newsletter, that you think about what is the point of the story? What is it trying to communicate? How is it conveying the mission and goals and vision of the organization? And then think about, now that I've got this great story that does that, what can I do with it?
Yeah, exactly.
So I really liked what you were saying earlier about, collecting stories all the time, so that when you have someplace that needs them, you've got a great reservoir of them to pull from, and you can pull the right thing for the right use rather than scrambling to get something that plugs a hole.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something so many organizations struggle with is they just don't collect stories on a regular basis. So then you come up to this point, like you said, with the newsletter, where it's like, oh my gosh, we need a story. We need to find one now.
Yeah.
Or, if you're getting ready to launch a capital campaign or anything at that scale, you've got to have stories that kind of form the creative side of that campaign to emotionally engage people. And, it makes your work so much harder. And the funny thing is, though, is that you encounter stories every day. So it's just about forming this habit of writing down stories and documenting them as you find them, and keeping them, in your back pocket until that point where you do need a couple and you can pull them out.
Absolutely. I always talk about, creating a culture of
Mm-hmm.
story gathering at an
Yes.
organization. And so many times people struggle with getting their board members to do things for them or figuring out what they want their board members to do for them.
Mm-hmm.
And, they're always inviting them to events and different things. And then people don't really know what to do or what they should be talking about. One of the things I always suggest is, tell all of your board members that you want them to be story gatherers because
Yes.
they're going to be walking around these events and doing these different things and meeting people. And it's not to say that they have to sit there and interview them at an event, but to get them all thinking, oh, I've just talked to this person. I should really connect that person to Vanessa after this meeting and ask them while I'm talking to them, say, we would love to really get your story. Can someone call you after this event and follow up with you on that? And really just
Mm-hmm.
make them think about that. It can really change, even your board members' engagement with the story of your organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
So once you've got all of this stuff, you've been spending all these times and you really have changed your culture and your organization is
Mm-hmm.
now collecting these stories. Where have you found to be the places that people can use them that really make them shine, that really give them, I hate to use that word impact over and over again, but really can, do the two things that we need to happen in an organization, get people to connect with the cause and your ability to facilitate that cause happening, the results of that cause happening, and the personal connection that drives the feeling of wanting to give and donate to support these things happening.
Mm-hmm.
So, what places have you seen when you work with people that really, that stories really, really work?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question, and I feel like I could answer it in so many ways. I think my first answer to that question is the most successful places you can tell stories are the places where your target audience already exists. So where those eyeballs already are, because that's probably going to be your best place to have an uptake on people being interested in reading or watching the story.
Mm-hmm.
So having kind of taking a pulse rather on what's going on with your audience, whether it's online or offline. And I would say, I mean, measuring online audiences is a little bit easier. So,
Right.
knowing which social media channels have higher engagement levels, where people are responding to things, and conversing with someone from your organization, or, maybe it's your newsletter that's really successful, and you have a good size list and good open rates, people are clicking through things. But that's not to say that you should forget about offline channels too, because there are donors who won't necessarily engage with you online, but are getting your direct mail and things like that. So I think the thing about offline channels is they're a little bit more straightforward. Your options are pretty much newsletters and direct mail. And those are both easy places to put in a story. And I think that those are good places to start.
Right.
But when you move into the online world, you have to start thinking about, where's the best choice for my audience? What's most convenient for them? And then the second part is, if your goal is driving donations, based on where you're putting that story, can you easily get someone to click through again to answer the call to action and land on your donation page or whatever that might be?
Mm-hmm.
And that can be a little bit more tricky. So, I mean, ideally, of course, the best place is to have that story on your website and just be driving traffic back to your own website, so that people are kind of contained there rather than, having them over on Facebook and then clicking into a post and then clicking over to your website. It's a few more steps and you might get some drop off there and less conversion. I think in terms of the medium itself, though, I've always been a fan of video. I think it's just the most wonderful way to capture emotions, humanity, and just a deep level of authenticity. And I also think that, because the internet's made so many of us just this kind of like multimedia hungry individuals where we really crave, visuals and graphics, moving pictures. It's great to be able to give people something a little bit more than just text to engage with. So whether that's a video or a really interesting graphic or some great photographs, I think those can all be good options for social media or newsletters, anything of that nature.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that actually leads into me being able to say that this storytelling podcast that we're doing is actually the first of a 3-part series. And the third speaker that we're going to have is actually Chris Davenport from Movie Mondays. Yeah. So he's actually going to be speaking on the topic as well, and how that translates through video at a little bit of a deeper level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Chris is great. I work with him quite often, so
Really?
You'll have a wonderful interview with him.
Yeah, and it's funny. And I met him here on the East Coast when we were both actually speaking at the same event. So it was such a nice opportunity. And the middle speaker in the series is actually going to be Pamela Grove. I don't know if you know.
Yes.
So we're going to have a couple of different perspectives on storytelling. So do you have any suggestions for great resources for where people can learn to be better storytellers? Are there good books, and also any sort of thing that's going on, and you're working on a book, so tell us a little bit about maybe places where you've learned some things, and share a little bit about the website that you have, the blog, and the books that you're creating to help people learn more about this.
Sure. Well, I think my favorite resource, and the one actually that sparked a lot of my interest in kind of the donor knowledge gap and understanding audiences, is Lee Lefebvre's book called The Art of Explanation. A great book on kind of the basics of communication and how to explain something to someone who is not yourself. And
it's so funny. Sometimes it's the simplest things that get you.
Exactly. Yeah. That book has always been kind of an interesting, constant source of inspiration for me. And I would also say Nancy Duarte's book, Resonate, also talks a lot about audiences and understanding how to best present information to your audience, which I think is a really important part of storytelling. And her book has a lot of undertones of how to construct stories as well, which is great. In terms of other resources, Chris Davenport is actually hosting a nonprofit storytelling conference in November, which I will be at. It's going to be a wonderful event. So if there are people who are looking for much more in-depth training on storytelling, I can guarantee that that's going to be a great training opportunity and a really fun weekend and a great conference.
Oh, that sounds terrific. And I will put a link to it when it goes live into the show notes.
Yeah, I think I think the website is nonprofitstorytellingconference.com, but I can check on that.
Fabulous. All right, terrific.
And then I am always blogging about storytelling over at thestorytellingnonprofit.com. And my book will be out in September, which will be a conglomeration of a lot of research and case studies that I've done in the last couple of years on storytelling. So I'm hoping that will also be a great resource guide for people as they look to other nonprofits and best practices in the sector for storytelling.
That sounds terrific. And I would highly recommend that if you are not already over on the Storytelling Nonprofit, that you sign up for Vanessa's emails so that you don't miss any of the blog posts that she puts out. They're really terrific. They are really engaging. I always find that when you get a chance to read the work of a storyteller, that you get to both read the stories that you're talking about and really read how somebody that knows about storytelling communicates and distributes a story. So you get sort of, extra bang for your buck when you sign up and get a chance to watch how experts do this type of work.
Thank you, Beth.
So thank you so much for joining me today. Is there anything else that I missed? Any other key point that I really should have made sure that I cover here?
No, I feel like we covered a ton of information. So I hope that folks have a couple actionable ideas that they feel like they can go work on in the next week with storytelling at their organizations.
I think that's terrific. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for your time. It was great speaking with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Beth.
All right, great.
Thank you for listening to Driving Participation. For more strategies to boost involvement in your organization, subscribe in iTunes and follow Beth Brodowski on Twitter. Driving Participation is a production of Iris Creative Group Incorporated. Communication builds community.